Because if you don't do that and you just make decisions quickly in the company all around, you accidentally, whether you know it or not, create culture.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories.
Welcome back to So Here's My Story. Before we get started, we have a little announcement reminder kind of thing. I was just remembering. Remember we used to say, welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
Yeah. Okay. Apparently you didn't remember for a second there. Anyway.
I didn't remember for a second until you went, I'm Jody. I'm like, oh yeah. Yeah.
So, speaking of things growing and evolving, our birthday is coming up September 1st. And each week leading up to it, we are doing a drawing of anyone who is either in the Facebook group or has joined the texting platform, which you can join by texting 410-632-6894. You can find that number as well as a link to the Facebook group on our webpage at sohere'smystory.com. And this week's winner is Chris Mullet, who is in our Facebook group, but also just joined the texting platform. So that's exciting.
And has known you since when?
Oh, like I was probably 12 or 13 or 14 when I met him. So
nice.
Yeah, so a longtime friend. So it was fun to see his name pop up. And you will definitely want to consider joining the Facebook group because as you will hear in today's episode, I will be posting a picture from that I find very funny. I don't know that that's the draw for everyone that it is, but I don't know. You can decide. All right, here we go. So here's my story. I was looking at Facebook memories this morning, as I do many mornings, to get my day started. And there was a series of photos from a vacation that we took in 2014 with the kids, where we went from San Francisco all the way up into Seattle and Vancouver. And this particular day that I posted about today was at Crater Lake, which is about midway through our trip. And there is this picture of Kaya, my daughter, and she had chosen to use her vacation money that we had given the kids, like, this has to last you 2 whole weeks, and, a huge bulk of it to buy this very authentic looking park ranger outfit. It's like the green shorts, this like khaki shirt. I will put a picture in the Facebook group because it is hysterical. The sunglasses, a hat. It's like this incredibly authentic, but she was like 8 at the time, maybe 9. I can't do the math quite quickly enough in my head. She's 14 now. So however old she would have been at that time. And, so she says, can I put it on now? And we're like, sure. So she goes in and puts it on and then comes out in this, like, almost sort of just like the way Amy Poehler takes on a character, where she just is this like crotchety, like cranky NPS person, which is kind of funny because they're not usually that way. They're actually usually quite lovely. But she's like walking around barking orders at people. Like there's like a get off the, don't step on the grass kind of thing. And she's like pointing to it. And she was like saying things to people and they were doing it. Like people were moving. It was just this and she would not drop character for like hours she wore this thing. And so I was looking at that this morning and I was laughing. And here's the part where it comes around to a story for this podcast is I started off thinking about parenting, obviously, because as my son is going away to college in a couple of days, as we can't seem to do an episode without me mentioning. And so I've just been thinking a lot lately, like I think as you end kind of like as any transition happens anywhere, you look back on what did I do well? What do I wish I'd done differently? What could I have done better? And looking at that just really sealed something about how pleased I am that a lot of my parenting decisions revolved around just staying out of their way, letting them be themselves and do things I never would have even thought about. But here's the interesting thing, and this is where I think it really ties back to at least topics of culture, if not some other things that you may come up with as we go. But as I thought back, there was no point in my early parenting days where I made this list of things that like, I want my kids to be funny. I want my kid, or, to have a good sense of humor. I want my kids to, be quirky or, like I didn't make like some list like some people do with like designing culture or like establishing this. it's like all the things that I'm most proud of happened in these interstitial tiny moments of in every moment where I didn't want to do a certain thing, or sometimes it was confronting. That was an easy one. This particular example didn't come with some big decision on my part. I just thought it was hysterical. But I can give some other examples as we talk where there were moments where I was like, ooh, how do I want to handle this? And in each moment, the things that became our driving culture of our family and what really shaped them as people were all these momentary decisions where I had to decide what matters most to me in this moment. Like, what do I most care about? What are the things I care about? And that's what shapes your parenting style, or that's what shapes culture, not these sort of advanced big decisions. Not that it's not important to decide what your values are. There is value to that. But I'm just really, really present to how much it happens, because I just started thinking of all these moments where some of the things I most love about my kids, I can think back to moments where I had to make decisions quickly, like the very first time a parent of a kid that one of my kids loved to do sleepovers with said, "Oh, does Turner want to come over tonight and spend the night?" I was like, "Oh, I'm sure he does. Hold on a second. Turner, do you want to go to this friend's house?" He's like, No, I don't want to go." And I was like, oh no. Like, now I have to either say, and in that moment, but he's standing right there. So if I'd made up an excuse, like, "Oh, we have someplace to be, I forgot," then I'd be teaching him that that's what you have to do. That's what I wanted to do, I'll be honest. But in that moment, I thought, oh no, I care. Like, what do I care about? I want him to see that you can say, I don't want to, I adore you and you're still my friend. And I just don't feel like spending the night at someone's house tonight. And so anyway, that's my sort of parenting reflection turned cultural conversation and maybe other things.
Well, I'll tell you. So two things occur to me, or two examples occur to me. One in business, one personal and family. So in business, and this was a meeting that happened fairly recently. There was we had a client who is embroiled in this pretty bitter litigation with a partner, because it's as close as business law gets to divorce. And so there are all of these emotions, et cetera. And a deposition arose, and the client, for whatever reason, really expected Lacey, who was handling the case, to kind of attack during this deposition, mic drop, to do all that stuff. And so that's not the best tactic.
You can't handle the truth. Oh, that's the wrong side. Never mind.
So that's not the best tactic for a deposition. And the client called me to complain, basically, about Lacey. So we set up a meeting at which Lacey was present. But there are two priorities in that kind of conversation, or two things that are warring to be the priority. It wasn't even a close decision, but those two things are, obviously, you want to make sure that you have client satisfaction,
right,
or you exceed
kind of
expectations.
Important.
What's that?
Kind of important in business.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of important in business. And so I wanted to make sure that the client felt heard, couldn't cut him off at the knees. But the other thing that is the priority to me, the way I run it, is that there's not ever going to be a time that anybody who works for me thinks that I don't have their back. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't talk about, oh, could this have been done a different way? Could that have been done a different way? Or that, we've been wrong before. Which
could arguably also be having their back. I mean, that doesn't have to be like always saying that they're right and that they did the right thing.
Right.
But to your point, you're not going to throw them under the bus.
Not throwing somebody under the bus.
Right.
You have to make, I believe, and one of our guiding principles, and mine in running the small company that I have, is that the people who work for me know that I have their back.
Yeah.
So I had the discussion with the client. We went into the meeting, but at each step, while I wanted to make sure that we could not only calm the client down, but basically show the client what the strategy is and further the goal of client satisfaction and client fulfillment, I had to make sure that every step that I took leading up to the meeting and going through the meeting, everything I said in the meeting, satisfied that first priority to me. which was making sure that she knew that I had her back.
Yeah.
Because that's my long-term interest. And it's not that there's anything that I put in terms of policy, but I do think that I have to look at, okay, how am I going to handle something is always guided by what's the thing I want most.
Yeah. And that was, and so the interesting thing is, like, as often as culture comes up, I think I often see where there's sort of this aspirational view of what people think they are, like, oh, we're this and we're that. But then they miss the fact that in little moments where, like, just take the two that you just used, customer satisfaction and sort of the visceral experience you can have in the moment. I'm imagining, a client calls, you're not expecting the call. They're upset because somebody didn't do something. There's a tiny part of you who looks for the easiest way out in that moment, at least momentarily.
Yeah.
You want to just be like, oh yeah, she's an idiot. Sorry about that.
That's horrible. Well, I'm going to step in and make everything right.
Yeah, let me fix it, and everything will be fine. And it can feel like because it's the fight, or it's almost that fight or flight response. Like, oh my gosh, let me let me fix that for you, and not realizing that you are even invisibly. Because even if you never say a word about Lacey, like I made a joke a second ago, like, oh, she's terrible. You don't even have to say that. If you're just like, oh, I'm so sorry you had that experience, let me fix that for you. And that's all you say. You are quietly, silently throwing her under the bus.
Yeah,
and
right.
She'll feel that. And so I think that sometimes disconnect can be so invisible, because when there's a threat facing you, it can be harder to remember that you have a bigger priority, goal, mission that actually makes staving off that threat harder or more complicated, because you have to balance this other thing. You can't just make that better, because it will have deleterious effect on like some other thing. And
and one of the advantages is that Lacey, and anybody here, if they know that that's your priority, then they feel more free to say, hey, but we need to have an honest conversation. If there's something I did wrong, if there's something I should have done better, if you have suggestions, then it's a more safe environment, because she knows the priorities. And she did come to me and she said, look, I think I did a really good job, but you read the transcript, you tell me what I should know or I should learn. And when everybody knows your priorities and you act in accordance with those, for me, it's created a culture that I like so much, that even when we're slammed with work and people say, oh, are you hiring? I think, I should hire. I'm not going to hire because I don't want to mess with what we have.
That's interesting. That could be a whole other episode, actually, Elliot. But I think I sometimes, it's a little bit, what's that saying, like that, oh, that's a pretty basic saying, but like actions speak louder than words. And I think I see it in, people are sometimes confused by either surveys they get back on engagement reports, or conversations about culture, and they're confused, like, well, why do people have that impression? And I think there's something to like look at the tiny moments. I saw a thing the other day that said something like, when someone doesn't understand something, they will assume it's a threat, which I thought was really fascinating. And sometimes when, leadership often has to make decisions that they don't have the luxury or time or ability to share like every decision process with everyone, to explain how we came and why and what was going on here. And so in the best of situations, sometimes people just might not have a line of sight to why something is the way it is. And assuming for a second, because I don't know that I 100% agree with that statement, but I think there is some truth to that. If someone doesn't understand something, that it's much more likely to be interpreted as a threat or a potential threat.
Well, I think it is. And I think that actually explains something. I said I had two examples, one business, one personal. So, and that explains the personal one. As you know, my oldest is going into his senior year at Colorado, and he wants to take a gap year. Because there are certain things, and I won't go into all of that, but there are certain things, and he explained his reasoning for it. And part of the reasoning has to do with COVID, the Delta variant, and part of it just is mental fatigue. And I will tell you, here's the crotchety old man 1950s dad conversation I had with him when I was just alone in the car, right? When I was just going off, and I'm pointing, and I'm like, you know what I did? You know what I do when I am not feeling up to going to work mentally, when I'm mentally not feeling up to it? You know what I do? I go to work. That's what I do. Okay, so that's my
10 miles uphill barefoot
10 miles uphill
with rocks
every day. And I get that through in the car. But when I'm talking to him, going back to what you had said, that if you don't understand something, maybe you're more likely to interpret it as a threat. So I had to think through it, and I didn't do it in quite that way until now. But the threat to me is, oh, he's not going to go back. He's never going to get his degree. He's going to be shiftless and aimless and whatever for his life. But if I put that aside, if I say, well, wait a minute, is that really, are the things I care about really threatened by this notion of a gap year? Or if they're not, is there something to be gained as long as he takes responsibility for it? And I had to come around to thinking, what do I really care about there? I care that he's the captain of his own ship.
Yeah.
So if he wants to take a gap year, and I told him, you can do that, but you have to be self-sustaining.
Yeah.
So there's a price. You have to learn responsibility, but you're the captain of your ship.
Yeah.
And I had to kind of put that I had to leave that conversation in the car about, I never took a gap year. I went straight through. I did this. But that's not what I care about. That's just
right.
my threat response.
Yeah. It's and I can think of, as I was driving home from the gym this morning, I just thought of like 15 examples where I had to decide in the moment, sometimes really hard ones, based on what did I really care most about. And the reason that it popped up originally and why it made me think of it when I saw that picture of Kaya in that outfit is that one of the things that I love most about both my kids is that they are captain of their own ships. They're very much their own people. They're not very swayable, which can be frustrating sometimes as a parent, because I'm like, you should like be doing some more of this. I'm like, nope, they're their own people. And I like that about them. And for a minute, I was sort of feeling like that's just how they popped out, that's who they are. And I think there's definitely some truth to that. But I think it's also because I prioritize that a lot. And it's, and I guess that's sort of the point back to culture, is that what you prioritize doesn't exist on a sheet somewhere or in some statement you do at the all hands meeting each quarter or something. It shows up in every little decision and what you support and what you don't support and what you back and what you allow. And I think my greatest fear of that happened one time when, not greatest fear, that's a little bit of hyperbole there. But Turner loved video games as a kid. And I, again, decided, like, I let him play video games that were a little advanced, as far as like age-wise, what he was supposed to be buying or whatever. And I was fine with that, probably because I played a lot of video games as a kid. But the one that I had always had this hard no on was Grand Theft Auto. And because I just think it's just got some depravity to it that I think is, and you get points for beating up hookers and things like that. And I'm like, sure. I'm hard no on Grand Theft Auto. And he kept relentlessly asking every so often for it. And I was like, it's a no. And I'm actually a little irritated because I'm so gracious on all these other things. Like, this is my boundary. We're not crossing it. I'm getting irritated that you're bringing it up. So he came to me this one time. He said, can we talk about Grand Theft Auto? And I was like, I said, we can, but if you are setting me up for yet another one of these conversations, I'm going to be irritated because you know where I stand on this. And I've explained why. And he said, well, here's my thought. And then he laid out this plan. He said, we can download it for free this weekend, so it won't cost us anything. While we have it for the 3 days, I can show you how I don't want to do the missions, which is where all that stuff is. I just want to be able to like drive the cars and you like get a job and you can do this thing. You can like get, I forget what all this stuff was. It's basically like the sandbox play. And I can show you how that part doesn't do that. And then I can show you how you can see to look in on me if I've done any missions or this kind of thing. And at the end of the 2 to 3 days, if it doesn't, he goes, because I think that is the things that you said you didn't like about it. And so if you don't feel like it's a good fit, then I can delete it at the end of the weekend, and I won't be a jerk about it, and it won't have cost us anything, and blah, blah, blah. And I sat there in that moment because, much like your car conversation, every cell in my body was like, no, I said, I just don't like this game and I want it to stop being a conversation. However, what I valued in that moment was a kid who could come to an authority figure with a well thought out plan that did check every single box of my concern and was minimal risk and had an out and didn't set me up. And I thought, in this moment, I value that more, and there's low risk to this kind of thing. And so and I was really nervous about that one. But it's those things like, what do I value most? What do I value most? And making sure that you're keeping those, because if you don't do that and you just make decisions quickly in the company all around, you accidentally, whether you know it or not, create culture. And so I think if you don't like the way the culture feels, don't look big picture, look at every little moment of where you're making decisions and what those decisions transmit that you value and care about.
Well, and so there are a couple of things about that story that I think are really valuable. First, I would take out the word kid, because I think what's valuable is if anybody comes to an authority figure, whether it's at work or whether it's at home.
Absolutely.
With a well thought out plan. What that means is a couple of things. Number one, it means that the authority figure, whoever that is, has to have communicated the reasoning behind the decision. Mm-hmm. I don't like the points for beating up hookers. I don't like the depravity. I don't like this, whatever happens to be. So you have to communicate why you have such a visceral reaction. You have to have an environment where the person does not feel that he or she would be run out on a rail by challenging something or picking at something that's obviously a sore spot, as long as they have something well thought out. The other part of it, which wasn't part of the story, but it is certainly figures into my thinking, is that there's a value in a pause. So I needed time between my rant in the car and when I actually spoke to David. And I recognized that I need that time. So when David was laying out this plan to Nikki on the phone, and Nikki and I was there. I had just gotten home, so I was kind of sitting down and playing with the dog and whatever. And Nikki said, I heard kind of her end of the conversation, and she said, "Well, why not? Dad's right here. Why don't I put him on the phone?" And I went, "No." I just shook my head, and Nikki was like, "No." And the reason I did was not that I didn't want to talk to him, is that I knew that the conversation would not go well because he was picking at a sore spot that I had on this particular issue. I want him to get his degree. I want him to go through. I want him to do this. And I also knew that I haven't had time to pause. I haven't had time to process. So that it didn't matter whether he came to me like Turner came to you with a very well thought out rationale. I knew that mentally I was not in a place to be able to stop saying what my immediate or doing my car rant, what my immediate reaction was. And the value in the pause, I think, is something that's also overlooked.
Definitely.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village,
Yes, it does.
we'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky
Ooh,
team.
yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of
Lovingly
ways.
snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Including wrangling us.
Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.